Good afternoon. As the rest of you are wending your way through the lunch line and to the table, we are going to go ahead and get started to stay on schedule. My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the director of the Library and Museum here at the American Philosophical Society, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for a wonderful presentation. Before we begin, however, I want to start, as we always do, by acknowledging on whose land we reside. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. Now, I recognize many familiar faces in the crowd today, but just in case you're new, I wanted to give a brief introduction to where you are before we have our featured discussion. So, the American Philosophical Society was founded in 1740. You guys can all say this with me at a certain point, right? Was founded in what year? 1743, very good. I won't make you go through 1743, that's right, by Benjamin Franklin and his associates as an analog to the Royal Society in London and other European peers, a place where scientists could gather and share information about innovation, about new research, about ways to help frame the colonial experience as they saw in its advancing years. What I always love, and I pulled this one out as I've mentioned in past talks, because I'm intrigued that in 1743 they thought a philosophical society was needed now that the first drudgery of settling the colonies was passed. It was not, in fact, passed, as we shall see in today's discussion, but they definitely thought that there was room for intellectual discussion, intellectual exchange, which we continue, of course, to this day. We do so in a variety of ways. The American Philosophical Society has an elected membership of about 1,000 members, most of them residing within the United States, and among them over our years have been 100 Nobel laureates. We also have 2 very large meetings of those members a year, one of which will be next week. So if you are sitting at a table with APS staff and they look a little tired, now you know why. We also have library and museum conferences and then dozens of special events and lectures like the one that you are attending today. We have North America's oldest continuous operating press, the APS Press, and we support about 50 residential fellowships that come to our library here, folks who come to our library here to do research, and about 300 grantees whom we send around the world. Very briefly, we have an extensive collection that primarily focuses in 3 areas: early American history, the history of science, and Native American and Indigenous studies. We also have a robust museum collection about which I will say more in just a moment. Their work is funneled through 4 academic centers that reflect those areas of collection concentration, as well as our Center for Digital Scholarship, which supports them all. And how do you do it? We say? We do it through friends like you. So on your table, we have given you a few pieces of information to take home. The first that is red is our scholarly program brochure that tells you what else is coming up in the near future. The second is a Friends brochure that tells you more about the Friends program and how you can join if you're not already a member. And the third is a bookmark to let you know about our signature, one of our signature programs this year, which is, of course, our exhibition. Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, opened just last Friday, and we are open Thursdays through Sundays from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. This is a free exhibition, and it's a wonderful exploration about life in revolutionary Philadelphia. I should say this is one of the first times we did an exhibition that borrowed so heavily from other institutions. The APS collections are represented, but so are those of many other repositories here in the Philadelphia area, including the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Museum of the American Revolution, the Kislak Center up at the University of Pennsylvania, and many, many more. So I do encourage you to take a look. And now, without further ado, let me introduce today's program. In July of 1824, Edward Geoffrey Stanley arrived in New York at the end of a nearly 5-week voyage from Liverpool. The young MP and the future 14th Earl of Derby was under a cloud before his departure. His political career off to a rough start because he was in love with a young lady that he was forbidden to marry. A lengthy tour, or as Stanley termed it, a banishment, had been imposed on him. And from July of 1824 until March of 1825, he traveled extensively throughout the eastern half of North America. Today's talk is about that journey. Our guides on this sojourn will be the Countess of Derby, who, with her husband, has spent the last 3 decades restoring Knowsley Hall, the Derby family ancestral seat. The book just published and available for sale following this presentation is about the 14th Derby's tour of North America. I should also add, as 2026 and the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is just around the corner, that the Countess is a direct descendant of General Charles Cornwallis, who lost the Battle of Yorktown, and that Knowsley Hall once hosted General John Burgoyne, who lost the Battle of Saratoga, as he was married to Lady Charlotte Stanley, sister to the 12th Earl of Derby. And speaking of Cornwallis and Burgoyne, a connecting sentence not all of us get to say, joining Lady Derby is Dr. Andrew O'Shaughnessy, who served for nearly 2 decades as the Vice President of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello and as the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies. He is also the author of, and here is my connector between these two speakers, The Men Who Lost America: British Leadership, the American Revolution, and the Fate of Empire, which was published by Yale University Press and received 8 national awards. He is indeed the author of many volumes, including my personal favorite, one of his first, An Empire Divided, the American Revolution and the British Caribbean. Please join me in welcoming Lady Derby and Dr. O'Shaughnessy to the stage.
So thank you very much, Michelle, and to Patrick Sparrow, who kindly invited us to speak here. Andrew, I know, feels very much at home, but this is the first time I've been to APS, and I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you for inviting us. I'm going to let Andrew start because this is quite a good little title. It's the strapline for our book, and he will explain why.
So we're talking about a journal that records a trip that ended almost exactly 200 years ago by Edward Stanley, later 14th Earl of Derby and 3 times British Prime Minister. I think that this is really will at some point be regarded as the finest British account of antebellum America. It was published once before in 1930, but only 50 copies were made Those went to family members and to the hosts of the then 17th Earl of Derby, who was visiting the Kentucky Derby, and he gave these out to his American hosts. It's very limited. Only 3 libraries, as far as I'm aware, have copies, and only one historian quotes it, and that's his biographer. So it was this quote that really caught my eye when I read the transcript for the journal. And what I found very impressive is I'd never seen a comment like this anywhere else. And I was looking it up again, talking about the possibility of one day having a black president. And when I looked it back up just last night, I was reminded that he wrote that in the section in which he's talking about Philadelphia. And it's a very nuanced discussion of race in America, where he firmly comes down with the viewpoint that any differences were due to nurture and opportunity, not to nature and intrinsic differences. And I found that remarkable for an Englishman of this period visiting America.
And especially a man who grew up in such an elitist way. He was a true liberal. This is the man himself, Edward Geoffrey Stanley. They're all called Edward, so we often use their second name. He was one of the most high-profile and aristocratic people to visit America, especially after the 1776 war and the 1812 war. And it was a time when there was a great deal of angst, as you all know, between our two countries. And I feel that this book is, in fact, very important because it's a very early example of our special relationship, because he's very positive about America. He says that it's a country that really should be engaged with again by the British people. It's very hard to romp through 19 earls and 600 years of history, but I'm going to try. Basically, my husband's family, well, and my own family, I'm a Neville married to a Stanley, which caused some concern after the Battle of Bosworth. But anyway, so the first, the seventh Earls were very involved in military battles. Obviously, the first Earl of Derby swapped sides and took the crown with him and effectively ended up killing Richard III and putting the crown on his stepson's head, King Henry Tudor. And then the fourth, fifth, and sixth Earl, this is not very well known in America, but they were sponsors and patrons of William Shakespeare. And we're pretty sure that Shakespeare spent time at Knowsley and also the other estate, which is called Meriden, which is in Warwickshire. Then the 10th Earl, he developed the art collection. The 12th, 14th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Earl have all been very heavily involved in racing and won lots of classics and Breeders' Cups and everything else you want to care to mention. And then the 13th Earl and the 10th Earl were very involved in building up the art collection, which is a world-class art collection. And it's that art collection that this very sensitive man grew up around. And his father was the 13th Earl of Derby, who was a tremendous bibliophile and scientist.
So he claimed he travelled 4,000 miles. That included significant parts of Canada, went out to the west, went southwest to New Orleans, Charleston, Georgia, and it climaxes really with Washington, D.C., and watching the outcome of the presidential election of 1825. That's a large, major section. He only spent 2 days in Philadelphia, and he wrote in the journal he really regretted it because it had been his intention to come back. He does go out to Lancaster and Carlisle and Harrisburg and describes them. He describes local courts, watching local courts. He doesn't visit the penitentiary like Dickens, which was still just being completed, but he was interested in what it was doing. But he uses the penitentiary as the entry to this discussion about race in America. And he says that a disproportionate number of people in the prison were free blacks, and that it invited social ostracism just to be seen walking with a black person. And we remember that Philadelphia was one of the more enlightened places and had one of the largest free black populations in America. But for me, that discussion is one of the most useful and interesting in the entire journal. So he was in America just a few years before de Tocqueville, almost the same age. Like de Tocqueville, he thought America very important. He was interested in the system of government. His route was very similar to that of de Tocqueville, and generally he took a very positive view of America.
So these are the notebooks that we found with the journals. So when the 17th Earl of Derby found the journals, and he had them published, these 50 copies, one went to the president, one went to the king, one went to the Wideners, I think that's how you pronounce it in Philadelphia. So we've got a list of who they all went to. But what he didn't find at the time were these notebooks. And these notebooks we've added into the back of the book because they really are history. They're so rich for the history of America. He talks about tariffs, the new tariff in 1824. He's not pro it. He obviously talks about slavery. He talks about meeting enslaved people, and he asks them how they are. So these notebooks really are the find of, for me, my lifetime at Knowsley Hall. So this is home, such as it is. The family have been here for 600 years. It used to be a hunting lodge, but before that, the family lived at Latham House, which is near Ormskirk. And then they moved here, and every successive Earl with his ego would put on another turret or chapel or wing. And this then became the focus because Cromwell, in fact, Cromwellian troops razed Ormskirk to the ground.
We continue to find new material there. It's the ultimate grandma's attic. It's a private archive. This letter...
Less of the grandma.
This letter was shown to me by the archivist who'd only discovered it while I was writing the introduction to this journal. And what I was able to find were letters written by Stanley during the tour, but also the three companions who traveled with him, John Stuart Wortley, Henry Le Boucher, John Evelyn Denison, who are all members of Parliament. And this really told us a lot about the dynamic between the group. He really never mentions these fellow travelers who'd all been at college with him, and also his dog Rover, who has to be sent back because he lived up to his name. But what we do discover from these letters is that he did intend at one point to publish the journal. It's quite clear that he edited it and improved it, and it also helps explain why he did not do so.
So his trip to America was in fact his second big journey. Knowsley is just on the top left, that's where the northwest of England is. And he rode on a horse from Knowsley to Naples when he came down from Oxford. He was a very extraordinary child and a very sensitive child when he grew up. He loved women. He was a very early feminist. He was particularly fond of his mother, who read him the Bible every night. And he had a huge love of the scriptures and an evangelical faith because of that. He adored his step-grandmother, who was a very famous actress called Eliza Farren. And she taught him public speaking. And age 4, he was put on our state dining room table and recited Julius Caesar's speeches, age 4, which I constantly tell my children about. He then went on to Eton, and he was a scholar at Eton. He won the Classics Prize at Oxford. He was at Christ Church for his poem called Syracuse. And when they were looking to name the city of Syracuse, an American said, excuse me, I read this wonderful poem, let's call it that. And so that is why Syracuse is actually called after Edward Geoffrey Stanley's poem. So he rode from Knowsley to Naples with his uncle, who was a tutor at Oxford. His uncle was 9 years his senior, and he didn't go on a buying trip. It was really to see what Europe was like. And the only thing we know he brought back was 600 Roman coins, which, again, we found in the archives. And when our curator pulled them down, they were in a lever arch file, not wrapped up, not even identified. And it nearly, the file nearly decapitated him because it was so heavy when he reached up to get it. But luckily he lives on because he's been very helpful finding all these things. So this is his leaver's portrait. When you leave Eton College, there is a tradition, you have a portrait made, and the original stays in Eton College, and then if you want, you have a second copy made. And we have a second copy, and it's in our study at home. Not only did he love scripture and Shakespeare, he also wrote poetry from the age of 9. And there is a very small privately published book on his early poetry, and it's remarkable. He wrote poetry in 5 languages from the age of 8, Greek, Latin, French, German, and Italian. And we don't know how he learnt those languages because those languages were not on the syllabus at Eton. So it's presumably self-taught or from the library at Knowsley. When he was at Oxford, not only did he study the classics, he educated himself about different religions. He studied the Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu faith. And that's very, very important for how his values developed and his views evolved. And he has this humanity and curiosity that is truly remarkable. So why did he go to America? This is the map that he made of his trip in America, and we've got the original in one of the manuscripts. The red dots are where he went, so he obviously did this drawing and then put the red dots afterwards. He went to America because his grandfather, the wicked Earl, banished him because he'd fallen in love with a girl who was a staunch Tory. And the family then were liberals. Later on, he becomes a conservative. But he's told he has to go and cool off and go to America. And he goes with these 3 friends. And the middle slide is of Eliza Farren. There was lots of cartoons because she was a famous actress and he was a great heir, and it was rather an unusual marriage. But she did marry the 12th Earl and became chatelaine, which was an unusual thing for an actress at that time. They were told not to keep in touch, but they did keep in touch because the fiancé, well, secret fiancé, because she wrote to his travelling companions, and Edward Stanley wrote to her mother, Lady Skelmersdale. So love always finds a way. They kept in touch the whole of the trip.
So Michel actually reminded me of another reason why he came to America, which was political. And you said he was under a cloud, and that is he'd broken from his grandfather's Whig views in a vote on Ireland. You know, he's very keen on more religious toleration in Ireland, and he dissented from his grandfather. And another reason he wanted to come to America was to investigate the possibilities of relieving poverty in Ireland by emigration to Canada. And he was part of a parliamentary committee, as were several of the people traveling with him. And so they were able to look at the feasibility of that at some length. The journal has many features. I've described the discussion on race, but one of the great features, and one thing that's different from de Tocqueville is purely analytical. And there are lots of sections, we're going to talk about a couple later, that are analytical. But it's also very descriptive, and because he was a poet and a good writer, they're very vivid. And so you've got these marvelous accounts of what it was like to travel in America before the railroad, what it was like to be on steamboats that seem to have become almost ubiquitous since Fulton's introduction of them in 1808, what it was like to go along an Appalachian mountain in a stagecoach with a precipice right beside you. Hair-raising accounts.
So he regularly hunted at home, and he also, when he was on his trip to America, he also hunted, which, if you'll remember the first portrait, he had ammunition, he's holding a gun. He really roughed it and had a gap year. I don't know whether you call it that. Yeah. But he really sort of got down and mucked in when he was on his gap year. And he chopped wood, he moved furniture. When the steamship stopped at night, he would go and collect the wood and have bonfires and bring it back on board, and generally get drunk when he was on land. The other thing that's interesting is he ate at the same table. He had no prejudice or artifice. He ate at the same table with the two travelling companions, servants that came with him. He ate with the innkeepers. When he was in Ohio, he was in an inn where they used one towel between all the guests, and they all had to use the same water in the basin, which is, you know, he grew up in that house I've just shown you. He had no prejudice, and he wasn't stuck up at all.
He takes a great interest in Native Americans, and whenever he can, he visits tribal sites and also archaeological work connected with Native Americans. He describes at length the canoes, how light they are, the ingenuity of their construction, and the way that they were used sometimes as tent poles in camps.
And Andrew's already mentioned how vivid the descriptions are. You can feel and see America at that time just from his own words, because he writes with a form of poetry. There's one very vivid description where he's going behind the Niagara Falls, and he almost feels he's going to die because slipping off the ledge, because of course there was no health and safety rail at that time. He was just completely awestruck by America, and he loved all of the innovation. He felt that America was much more advanced in terms of, you know, your building of bridges and things like that. He had to endure horrendous road conditions and communications when he was traveling. We complain about lines at airports, but really nothing compared to what he went through. Stagecoaches were often very crowded, and there was one description where they'd sold 10 tickets rather than the 8 that were there, and someone was plonked on his lap. And these are the corduroy roads, which logs which were attached at either end, and then they had sand. But of course that rotted, and if the wheel of the stagecoach went on it, then it would probably break.
So it's also a who's who of America in 1824-25. He meets everyone except Thomas Jefferson. And I could explain in the question time why that never happened. Although his companions went on, dined at Monticello, and met Jefferson, he did not. But he met John Adams while he was up in Boston. He went out to Quincy. There's a wonderful description in the journal, but also in the letters, not only by him, but by his friends. One of my favorite anecdotes was he noticed the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington behind Adams, and Adams looked at it and said, you'll notice he never smiled. He had such bad teeth, he never opened his mouth. And that's what made him a successful politician and why I failed. Lafayette was also touring America simultaneously. They were in Boston at the same time, and they met while Stanley was in Washington. And while he's in Washington, he's hosted every night by some of the great luminaries. John C. Calhoun, who was not known at this point as the sort of father of secession, and Daniel Webster, who really impressed him, and he helped to pay for Webster to visit Britain and set up introductions for him. Webster, of course, would be one of the great speakers for the Union.
And their visit coincides with the presidential election of 1824. They arrive in Washington on the eve of the announcement of the successful candidate. And they see the announcement of the result of the presidential election when they were actually in the House of Representatives. And he describes how dirty and grubby he finds the House of Representatives and the fact there are rats there. It's that level of detail. I don't need to explain to you that the 1824 election was dubbed the corrupt bargain.
Yeah, well, this was the first stolen election. And, you know, there were 4 candidates. None of them got the necessary 51% of the Electoral College. Andrew Jackson was clearly the winner in terms of the popular vote and the geographical breadth of his support. And, of course, he thought that the others had conspired in a corrupt bargain, as he called it, to keep him out of power. Nevertheless, they described Jackson in very positive terms as actually having behaved with great dignity, because they attend all the events surrounding the election. They go to James Monroe's farewell party at the White House and describe where people were standing, how they were interacting, including Andrew Jackson. As I say, they thought he behaved with great dignity. We know, of course, he was full of resentment and planning his next bid. And they also attend the inaugural of John Quincy Adams, which they praise for its simplicity. And they attend his party at the White House on his first night. Oddly, Stanley didn't like John Quincy Adams, even though the two would seem very alike, both classicists. Quincy Adams had largely been educated in Britain and Europe and married in London. But Stanley said his eyes were watering all the time. He never looked you in the eye, and he didn't feel he was someone you could trust.
So there are various themes, as Andrew's alluded to, in these journals. And there are many issues that are still present today, and actually even more present at the moment. He was really ahead of his time, very liberal, thought about things very deeply, and he considers race and money, privilege, colour, apartheid. He talks about the conditions of the slaves. He was really revolted and horrified by the conditions they were kept in. And he notes that racial views are no better in the North than they are in the South. He wrote that slavery was a stain on humanity, and he was particularly horrified in the trade of human flesh. And the fact that enslaved women were forced out into the fields very soon after their pregnancy had ended, and that they were often having babies every year. And he comes back, and that stays with him. And as colonial secretary, he abolishes slavery in the colonies. He meets Native Americans too. He spends 6 weeks with Colonel Talbot and James Fenimore Cooper, And he paints a very vivid picture of how they live, how they make their canoes. He meets Elizabeth Brandt Carr and says that she's very elegant and with the deportment of a Victorian society hostess. And he meets her father, corn planter.
So one of the themes he's interested in, he has, rather like Jefferson in Notes of the State of Virginia, very broad interests: the science, the industry, agriculture. But a major interest was education. And he was particularly impressed by the Northeast and New England and Massachusetts especially, and the extent of public education and high levels of literacy. That would be a great influence on his later political career. He also visits colleges and talks at some length about West Point, about Harvard, and what was then a great experiment, Transylvania University in Kentucky, the first attempt to have a secular university in America.
The other theme that runs through these journals is the literary impact he had. So, as we heard, he was obsessed by the scriptures, evangelical in his faith, loved Shakespeare. When he went round Europe, he travelled with one book in his pocket, which was Byron's Childe Harold. When he went to Canada, he travelled with James Fenimore Cooper, and they were so enchanted by Lake George that Stanley encouraged James Fenimore Cooper to write a novel, and that novel is The Last of the Mohicans, and it's dedicated to Edward Stanley. On top of that, a friend of Andrew's has discovered that there is also a connection with Charles Dickens, because he met Charles Dickens when he was a young scribe, and Jeannie Grant Moore, who's Andrew's friend from Oshkosh, she teaches American and English literature. She discovered that, in fact, he'd been the scribe who'd written the speeches as a young writer in Parliament, and so he asked him to come to his house to change one particular speech because he didn't think that the middle section had been well transcribed, but he liked the first and the third section, and it was a 6-hour speech. Then Jeannie has also discovered that the novel Martin Chuzzlewit is based on Stanley's trip to America, because Charles Dickens also goes to America in 1842, and if you look at the map there, it's pretty much identical to where Stanley went. But the most important impact of these journals is on his political legacy. It inspired latent ideas in him as a young man, which he then translated into his ministries. He became Chief Secretary to Ireland when he came back from America and went to live in Ireland as Colonial Secretary. He then put in free non-denominational primary education in every parish in Ireland because of what he saw of the American and, Canadian education. He became Prime Minister 3 times to Queen Victoria and Colonial Secretary as well. So everything he saw in America became a guiding hand for his later ministries.
Well, he was really a Burkean conservative ultimately, something that's disappeared on both sides of the Atlantic, but a very Whiggish view and belief that elites have a responsibility to those less well off, that they should encourage progress and improvement and managed change. And he is associated with several major improvements. He supported broadening the franchise in England, the 1832 Reform Act, and later, as Prime Minister, passed the 1867 Reform Act, which basically gave male workers in the cities a vote. He also, and I find this very remarkable, and if you look at Irish government websites, they say it's the only good thing England ever did for Ireland, and that was his role with the 1832 public schools in Ireland, creating a system of public schools that were non-denominational. And this was possibly influenced by his time in Canada, where he was fascinated to see how the British government had tried to find a balance between governing French Canadians who were primarily Catholic and a much smaller population of English Protestants. Although he was very much in favor of an established church, he felt very strongly about religious toleration.
So Stanley felt that slavery was the root of all evil, and it infected every part of society when it existed. 1833, he led the debate on the abolition of slavery as a direct result of witnessing the conditions of enslaved people in America. He didn't go to the colonies in the British Empire, but he would have known that it was the same there. And in 1833, he abolished the international trade of slaves in the British Empire. And it was him who took the money from the treasury and actually worked out how much he should pay each planter for each individual slave. And in the back, in the index of our book, you can see him working out when he's traveling here exactly what it costs to keep a slave, an enslaved person, and also how long they could work for and how much they could be bought and sold for. So he actually writes down the commercial consequences of slavery, and also the fact that he felt, as an early feminist, that women's bodies were dehumanized. We've only just finished paying off the debt that he took out to pay off the... he effectively borrowed £15 million, and we finished paying off, the Brits have finished paying off that debt in 2015 for the slavery.
It's controversial because, of course, he compensated the planters, not the enslaved, but it certainly avoided warfare. I don't recall any such idea in America as a way to avert a schism. And he was very disappointed at what happened in the West Indies, the British West Indies ultimately. He had expected that more provision would be made, and his son later went to the Caribbean, and he commented to his father, and the father commented back that this was not how he expected it all to end.
Sorry. The other thing is he was very religious and very tolerant of other religions through understanding different faiths. And in his early, he actually wrote a journal, but it was much more of a diary when he was traveling to Naples and on his grand tour of 1820 to 22. But you see two themes coming through in that journal, which I published in 2022. You see his revulsion for slavery because he meets enslaved people in Livorno and also in Venice, and he's horrified to see them shackled. And the other thing he sees during that trip is he's in Rome and he sees Jewish people are forced to process to the papal state and genuflect and thank them for their freedom annually. It's an annual ritual. And he writes, when he's only 20, that this is demeaning, this is wrong, and he's horrified by the sight of these people doing this. And it's very visual, his description. And again, that stays with him until 1858 when he's Prime Minister, and he passes a bill called the Jewish Relief Act, which means that for the first time, Jewish people who are actually practicing Jews can take up their seat when they're actually voted into and won a place in Parliament without putting their hand on the Bible. Because up to that time, they actually had to deny their faith because they had to swear allegiance to the crown as the defender of the faiths. And so it was Derby who said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. And the first person who benefited from the Jewish Relief Act was Lionel de Rothschild, and he'd been voted in twice and never taken up his seat, so never entered Parliament because he didn't want to put his hand on the Bible. So thank you very much for listening. It's a bit of a gallop through of so many different themes that come up in the book, but if you buy it and if you read it, you will not be disappointed.
So at this point, we have some time for questions, and we have 2 microphones that are making their way around the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Is this on? Yes.
Well, I wanted to hear why he did not want to meet Jefferson.
So the reason was because his grandfather relented his opposition to his getting married. And he simply told his friends he was leaving and going back to England. And he wrote to himself, "This is the best day of my life." The friends were very upset, and this I enjoyed when reading the letters. They said, "How gauche, and how could he just get up when we've been months together and leave?" But that was the reason. He had had a letter of introduction to Jefferson. The friends continued. They dined at Monticello, and they presented books to the new university library, which were probably from him. And there's no reason to think he wasn't originally planning to be part of the Virginia tour with them. And indeed, they were interested in possibly going on to Cuba and to Mexico, so it was cut short.
I just want to make a comment. Very enjoyable presentation. But it's interesting that the leading conservatives of the 19th and 20th century both were liberals who became conservatives, Churchill and Stanley. And I think that has left a legacy in the Conservative Party that has benefited it and has argued against retrograde thinking and being opposed to progress and so on and so forth. And I think that's really affected British society.
Well, I call it Burkean conservatism, very influenced by Edmund Burke, and it remained dominant really up until Margaret Thatcher. Harold Macmillan built more council houses than any other, government housing than any other administration before him. And you're quite right, it's really very strong. And in some ways rather sad that it's disappeared.
There was also the fact that his mentor was the 3rd Marquis of Lansdowne. So when he came down from, between the Grand Tour in Europe and coming to America, he spent a lot of time at Bowood House, which was basically the center of the Whig universe. And he gave him all the reading lists of what to read and gave him the interests in Ireland.
And the 15th Earl carried this on further in the rest of the century.
He mentored Disraeli, but Disraeli was very different. And Disraeli, of course, we associate with the massive expansion of the British Empire. He was not in favor of seeing the empire expanded, and he makes a fascinating comment about Canada and says it will never thrive like the United States because of British control.
First, I wanted to say thank you so much for your presentation. We were looking forward to having you. I had no idea how wonderfully you were going to touch on so many crucial time periods and personages throughout your history in terms of how Stanley had this extraordinary network of people with whom he was connected. My question is for Lady Derby. This is both a professional enterprise and a very personal enterprise for you. What inspired you to share, to research, to study, and to publish about your family history in this way?
2 things. Empty nest syndrome. And I'd also finished that house. So it took me 30 years to restore it. Then there was COVID, and our eldest 2 children had just finished Oxford. Our youngest was about to go up to university. So I had time on my hands, and I was also left alone in that house during COVID and had that time to read all these things. Whereas before, I'd, rather like Stanley, I'd been humping furniture, trying to put the house back together again. And also, because of COVID, we couldn't travel. When I found the European diaries, I just took them off, and I just wandered around Europe with them in my pocket. And it was just a wonderful thing to do, to be able to travel again. And I absorbed a lot of Stanley's views while he was doing that. And then it rolled on from that. So when we found the second book, I asked Andrew, and it sort of snowballed. We got a fan club. Everyone kept getting interested and invited, and, you know, we may end up making a Netflix series.
So she used to be curator, deputy curator to the Royal Collection, and her boss was a man called Sir Oliver Miller. And he had tried to go to Knowsley before, when it was owned by the uncle of the present Earl. And he went up, had lunch, and was expecting to see all the paintings and was very excited. The place had just not been opened up or made accessible. And they dismissed him after lunch and sent him back to London. Of course, as soon as they took possession of it, he was up there cataloguing everything. And that's the great feature that they've made so much available, handed a lot to the Liverpool archives, and given many more people an opportunity to study what they have.
I thought it was really interesting. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on his impressions of Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, because Jackson, of course, owned dozens and dozens of slaves, and Quincy was much more of a abolitionist. I mean, I understand that, like, maybe the initial impression didn't, you know, bode well, but when they were like running against each other, was Stanley actually in favor of Jackson winning?
No, he does say it was probably best. He felt he deserved to win, that he'd got the popular vote, but he also said he would not have been a good person in power.
But he rather
Yes.
liked Jackson,
Yes.
in a way, personality-wise.
Yeah, he thought he'd behaved with dignity during the process. He really liked Webster. They kept in touch longer. He was very impressed by John C. Calhoun, and that intrigued me because Richard Hofstadter, many years ago in the 60s, did a book, The American Political Tradition, and most of the people in it are presidents like Abraham Lincoln. And Calhoun is in it, and he says this is the brightest man of the 19th century. And Hofstadter was then a classic liberal of the 60s. He was later regarded as a bit of a neocon, but that was later. And he really points out that until he turned to secession, he was a major politician, and Stanley was impressed by him as well. Yes.
Thank you. I'm just wondering a little bit more, if you could give a little more explanation about his association with Ireland and how, you know, what transpired there, you know.
So he had an estate. You always can pronounce the name.
Yeah, the family had an estate called Ballykistine, and he goes and spends time there. He marries Emma Caroline Bootle Wilbraham, and they go and live there because when he'd been working with, staying at Bowood, he developed this interest in Ireland. And the Marquess of Lansdowne said that it was because of absentee landlords that a lot of the troubles were. So he put in this free, non-denominational primary education. He also stopped the Catholics paying tithes to the Protestant churches. And he spent time there and got to know the people and his lands. Because at the time, a lot of the English aristocracy did not go to Ireland. They just kept these vast estates. But he spent time there. He spent nearly 2 years there. And you could see him writing letters back to his father and grandfather.
And his treatment of Ireland was more complex. The man known as the Great Liberator in Ireland called him that scorpion, Derby. And the reason was that he was a traditional enough conservative to believe in maintaining the state church. And there was a movement among liberals to actually, and in some ways a pity it wasn't achieved, to disenfranchise the state church and remove a lot of the obstacles to Catholics. He did, though, vote for something called the Maynooth Grant, which must be the dullest of all 19th century politics, but it really split conservatives. And this was for a Jesuit college that the British government supported, so it was an attempt at least to show some largesse. And he was broke with his conservative allies to support it. And his great contribution in many ways was to isolate extreme conservatives in his party and to try to make them much more electable by not going to extremes. With regard to the Great Hunger and the Irish Famine, he was very typical of his day in believing that free market economics should, and I never know when we talk about libertarianism why no one raises this, that today it's so often conceived as British treatment of Ireland, but it's also very current in this belief in libertarian economics, to the point that you really ignore the suffering and consequences and forget about pragmatism.
Well, I'm afraid our time is up, but I want you to join me, please, in thanking Lady Derby and Andrew O'Shaughnessy for their presentation today. And again, I want to encourage you to take the flyers from the table so that you can see what other programs we have coming up, and to also take a look at the books that are available for sale in the back of the room. This is an extraordinary story about a remarkable individual that touches on many aspects of American history that I think would be of interest to this audience. So thank you again for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you again at the APS.